All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started here. If you can take your seats and welcome. I guess we should say at the outset before we get started, I think this is our first meeting in the legislature in the new building. Is that right, David? All right. Well, congratulations to Vicki and David and the whole team on the spectacular facility, and to the Maryland Stadium Authority on getting this done on time and on budget once again, and certainly a great facility for us to kick it off. Under budget. I've been corrected by the B&T chair, under budget. Any opening comments, Mr. Chairman? All right, well, without further ado, we're here for the fiscal briefing. David, welcome.
The governor's proposed fiscal 26 budget, focusing on the general fund, transportation trust fund, the capital budget, and a few other topics. Just as an opening, I would say the governor's presented a multifaceted plan to resolve a difficult budget challenge in front of you, and we have a whole book to walk you through the plan. So with that, I'll jump in, turning to page 1, which is on the screen, the quick look. You can see on the top of the page, the budget grows about 1.2%, or $791 million in total funds from fiscal 25 to 26. General funds actually decreased by almost $300 million, or 1%, both due to cost containment in fiscal 26, as well as to the 25 plan, including some fiscal 24 costs that are being covered with $25. Some key highlights on the budget: there's a general fund balance at the end of fiscal 26 of $106 million. There's a rainy day fund balance of 8% of general fund revenues, or a little over $2 billion. Key point, the Spending Affordability Committee had a goal of structural balance for fiscal 26. The administration's plan makes great progress, but does not reach that goal. They're $186 million short of structural balance. The General Assembly has met its SAC goals in all but one of the last 40 plus years. So in order to do that, you'll have to find additional ongoing cuts and or additional revenues to make up for that $186 million gap. There's a Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act with about $3 billion of actions. If you turn to page 2, it gives you sort of the highlights of what those actions are. Without the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, the budget would be out of balance by about $2.9 billion. But with it, you solve that hole and end up with a $106 million general fund balance. The biggest component of the BRFA solution is revenue adjustments, totaling $1.3 billion. More than half of that is personal income tax reform that I will talk about more in a couple of pages. There's also a suspension of the revenue volatility cap for 4 years. This frees up $272 million of general funds in fiscal 26 that otherwise would have been set aside as sort of a hedge against capital gains and other non-withholding income tax revenues not hitting the target. There's an increase in the sports wagering tax from 15% to 30% starting in the current fiscal year over fiscal 25 and 26. That generates over $100 million. There's a similar adjustment to the table games tax going from 20 to 25%. Transfers to the general fund account for a little more than $600 million of the actions, $230 million of it local income tax reserve fund transfer. There's a plan to repay this over 10 years beginning in fiscal 2029. This is kind of a perennial favorite when we've had difficult budget times in the past. This fund is often borrowed from as a temporary solution. Spending reductions total in the BRFA total over $1 billion. The largest single item is a cut to the appropriation to the rainy day fund. So putting less money into the rainy day fund. As I said before, you still have $2 billion in the rainy day fund even after the cut. The next biggest cut is the Medicaid hospital assessment. So we're increasing the state's hospital deficit assessment. It's an assessment on hospital charges. The revenues go into a special fund that supports Medicaid and relieves the general fund of having to cover some of those costs. On an annual basis, the assessment would go up by $100 million starting in fiscal 26. You see $93 million of savings in K through 12 teachers' retirement. Under current law, the locals cover the normal cost of retirement for the teachers, and then the state picks up the costs related to the unfunded liability. You get an unfunded liability when the investment returns come up short or when other actuarial assumptions aren't met. That unfunded liability amount for the teachers goes up by about $180 million in fiscal 26, and the administration is proposing that the locals cover half of that increase. And that is a permanent change, and what I mean by that is the locals would forevermore pay the normal cost plus the $93 million in each subsequent year. A couple other $50 million items. The core partnership fund is being funded with bonds rather than general funds. It's fully funded in the capital budget at the $50 million. And then there's some surplus fiscal 24 dollars that were supposed to be appropriated to address retirement liabilities and retiree health liabilities, and the governor is proposing not to put that sort of extra amount in. As you can see, there are many other reductions. I'm not going to go through them all right now, and we have a much longer list of all of the reductions in the BRFA later in the document. So let's turn to page 3, which looks at what does this budget do to the structural outlook. The blue bars in that graphic show you what we were forecasting back in December for the Spending Affordability Committee. You can see very substantial structural gap. The orange bars is under the administration's plan, what the structural gap looks like. And you can see they've made substantial progress in all of the over all 5 years of the forecast period, reducing the 2030 deficit down to $3.4 billion from what we were projecting at $6 billion. But a significant challenge remains. Fiscal 28 to 30, as you can see, has a very substantial challenge remaining, even with the governor's proposal. And as I mentioned before, in fiscal 26, you're not structurally balanced, which was your goal from spending affordability. All right, turning to page 4, we have another graphic here that shows that back in December, we projected a $3 billion cash deficit for fiscal 26 and about a $400 million cash deficit in fiscal 25. So this is trying to show, not just with the BRFA, but all the actions in the budget, how did the governor solve that problem? And basically, 40% of it is spending reductions, 40% is revenues, and about 20% is transfers. If you look at page 5, the graphic there shows you the spending in the budget compared to what we were forecasting back in December. The biggest decrease is the BRFA items that I've already highlighted. That's $1 billion as a savings. There are then 4 major areas of additional cost containment or savings. One is fund swaps. The administration was able to find special funds, federal funds, and bond premium revenues to cover some of the costs that we were assuming would be funded with general funds. The 3 sort of policy areas where there's some cost containment versus what we were forecasting are in child care. And one of the major reasons for the difference in child care is the administration is proposing to freeze enrollment at about 42,000 children in fiscal 26. Second area of savings is in public higher education, which simply just gets a smaller grant from the state than we were forecasting back in December. And then in the Developmental Disabilities Administration, there's nearly $100 million of cuts to the current year's budget and a couple $100 million in fiscal 26. All told, they're less than what we were forecasting back in December. So those are the biggest areas of kind of cost containment, if you will. The far right part of that chart shows there are areas where there's more spending, the biggest being Medicaid. We will be evaluating whether we agree with the administration's assumptions, but generally they're higher just because of slightly different assumptions than we had. The other big difference is in enhancements. And we've highlighted on page 6 what we see as sort of the enhancements that we were not expecting in the forecast back in December. I'm not going to go through this list in any great detail. I'd say more than 2/3 of the items are economic growth driven items, as the governor has talked about trying to stimulate the Maryland economy, and you can see that sort of sprinkled throughout the chart. We're going to turn on pages 7 and 8 to the tax and revenue provisions in the governor's plan. Overall, the income tax generated about $820 million more in fiscal 26 under the governor's proposals. That includes both changes to the personal income tax, including a surcharge on capital gains. So the one big piece is there are changes to the tax brackets, and those are shown in the graphic, and we've highlighted in yellow the brackets where there are changes. You can see at the bottom of the brackets, there's a consolidation into one tax rate of 4.7% for the first, for a single filer, the first 1,000 to 100,000 of their income. So it's a little bit higher rate for your first 3,000 of income, but a slightly lesser rate for that income between 3,000 and 100,000 for the individual filer. The other change in the brackets is adding two new brackets at the top, a bracket of 6.25% and a bracket of 6.5%. You can see for the single filer, that kicks in at 500,000 for the 6.25%, $1 million of taxable income for the 6.5%. On top of those bracket changes, there's this capital gains surcharge. So for anyone who has income of 350,000 or more, they will get a 1% surcharge on their capital gains earnings, income. There are some other changes as well. The governor is increasing the standard deduction, essentially doubling it from what current law would have it at, to $5,600 for a single filer and $11,200 for a joint filer. The governor is eliminating the option for people to itemize on their state taxes, so everybody would have to use that standard deduction. One other notable change is there's a child tax credit that currently provides a benefit to families with income of $15,000 or less. It's a $500 credit per child under 6 and $500 for children from ages 6 up to 17 who are disabled. What the governor is proposing to do is, under current law, once your income hits $15,001, you fall out and you lose the entire credit. He wants to phase it out, basically up to income of $25,000, so gradually phasing it out rather than losing all $500 at once. All right, if we turn to the next page, page 8, this lays out all of the different revenue provisions in the BRFA and in the governor's plan. The top half of the chart focuses on the taxes and fees. The dollar amounts are coded by what fund do they go to. So the black is to the general fund, the blue is to the blueprint fund, green to the transportation trust fund, and red is to various special funds. So you can see there's really a mixture of revenues going different places. I've hit on a lot of the big general fund items. A couple I haven't mentioned. The corporate income tax would be reformed in two ways. The governor's proposing to move forward with combined reporting, and then he offsets that a bit by reducing the corporate income tax rate from 8.25% to 7.99% over a 2-year period. And you see that doesn't really kick in until fiscal 28 and fiscal 29. And with respect to death taxes, the governor is proposing to eliminate the inheritance tax and just have the estate tax, and he's lowering the exemption on the estate tax from $5 million to $2 million. The idea is that this is a cost-neutral proposal and results in Maryland only having one death tax rather than two. In the transportation area, the biggest new item is a retail delivery fee of 75 cents per order. That is proposed to generate about $225 million a year. It is indexed to inflation in the out years. All told, these MDOT proposals would generate $470 million for MDOT in fiscal 26 and $420 million in the out years for the Transportation Trust Fund. So those are the major revenue provisions. I'm going to move on to page 9 to some other key features in the budget. K through 12 education. So the budget grows $550 million, or 6%. There are, however, some changes to the Blueprint Fund proposed, which are highlighted in that second large bullet. One is the Consortium for Coordinated Community Supports. This is the behavioral health part of the Blueprint, is reduced in terms of the mandate from $130 million a year to $40 million a year, and that is a permanent change. Second change that you've heard the governor talk about is the teacher collaborative time. We were supposed to start phasing in funding to reduce the amount of time teachers spend in the classroom so they have more time to collaborate. And that phase-in started in fiscal 26. The governor is proposing to postpone the phase-in until fiscal 2030. That saves about $124 million for the Blueprint in fiscal 26. It grows to about $500 million of savings by fiscal 29. In the revenue chart before, you saw that there are some new revenues for the Blueprint Fund starting in fiscal 28 that will support the fund. Two other areas of change. The concentration of poverty grant is fully funded per statute in fiscal 26. But for fiscal 27 and 28, the governor is proposing to pause the growth in that program, which will save a substantial amount of money. We're still scoring the impact. The bill is not actually in yet, so we don't have all the details at the moment. The other thing to note is that while there are all these cost-saving components, there's also new blueprint spending on a variety of different things. We've highlighted some of the big items in the bullet there. The Grow Your Own Educators program, which was passed by the General Assembly last session, is funded at $33 million, which was substantially more than what the fiscal note assumed last year. There's also $19 million for an academic excellence fund, which would provide literacy and math coaching. Moving on to health, there's 1% provider rate increase for most healthcare providers. As I mentioned, in the developmental disabilities area, there are substantial cost containments totaling about $100 million in the current year, $235 million in fiscal 26 in general funds. Turning to the next page, a couple of things. The University System of Maryland gets $105 million less in fiscal 26 than in 25, comparing apples to apples. That's before any fiscal 26 COLA and increments, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the second thing is there is actually a COLA of 1% and employee increments funded in the budget for all state employees. That costs $180 million of general funds in fiscal 26. In terms of local aid, this is an area there is quite a bit of cost containment. There's $144 million of costs that are being shifted from the state to local governments. So locals will actually be paying $144 million that the state was paying previously. And then there's about $124 million of other cuts to local aid. We'll have a whole chart on this a little bit later on in the document. Last thing on page 10 I'll mention, a little bit of good news. In the capital budget, the governor set aside $50 million for legislative additions to the capital budget. On page 11, we just hit some of the key issues for the session. Obviously, the sustainability of the budget, both in fiscal 26 and the out years, is a major issue. There's still this looming issue of what the new administration in Washington will do in terms of cutting the federal workforce, which would have an adverse impact on our economy, and cutting aid to state governments in general, which again could cause some fiscal stress. So nothing is built into the budget around that, but those are obviously risks to the budget as presented. The last thing I wanted to mention here is there's a bill you passed in 2023, the Child Victims Act, which will remove the statute of limitations for people who were the victims of sexual abuse in state facilities in the past. About 3,500 people have so far come forward with claims against the state. Almost all of them people who were in juvenile facilities since going back as far as the 1960s. The state's liability per occurrence of abuse is $890,000 per occurrence. So this is potentially an enormous liability for the state. The Attorney General's office has employed outside counsel, and they are negotiating with plaintiffs' counsel. There's nothing in the budget to make any sort of settlement payments. However, it is very possible that there will be a settlement reached before the end of session, and you all may be asked to find the money to make the first settlement payment, which could very easily be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But again, negotiations are ongoing, so we have no specific dollar amounts, but something to just be aware of that's not in the budget but could emerge in March or before you finish the budget. All right, I'm almost done talking. Page 12 is the last thing I'm going to talk about, which is the Blueprint Fund graphic. Just shows you how you're paying for the Blueprint implementation costs over fiscal 24 to 2030. The blue bars show you the ongoing revenues in the Blueprint Fund that are available to support the implementation costs. The green is the fund balance in the Blueprint Fund, which you see under the administration's plan will carry you through fiscal 27 and even cover a good portion of the fiscal 28 costs. But in fiscal 28, those implementation costs will exceed the money available in the Blueprint Fund, and that's where you see the yellow bar, the general fund costs starting kicking in. And you can see that grows substantially by 2030. And this is a big component of that structural gap that I showed you earlier for 28 to 30, is that these additional general fund costs get layered in. So I am done for now. I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Allison, who's our tax fiscal note expert, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the income tax proposal.
If you take a look at page 13 of the document, it shows the estimated effect of the administration's personal income. Taking a look at page 13 of the document, it shows the estimated effect of the administration's personal income tax proposals on 6 example taxpayers for tax year 2025. These taxpayers have assumed, oh, pardon. Can you hear me better now? These taxpayers have assumed income levels ranging from $25,000 to $1,250,000, and these are estimates prepared by the Department of Legislative Services for illustrative purposes today. A key point to keep in mind as you take a look at this chart is that the administration's personal income tax package is concurrently modifying income tax rates, and also the state and local income tax base through the enhancements to the standard deduction and the elimination of state itemized deductions. The first 3 columns specify the assumed household size, tax filing status, and federal adjusted gross income of each of our 6 example households. For ease of comparison, we've assumed that each of these example households had certain common characteristics. We assume each household includes 2 dependent children younger than age 13, one of whom is younger than age 6. We assume that these taxpayers are full-time Maryland residents and that their income is not subject to tax by other states. And we're assuming no adjustments to income for Maryland beyond the 2-income married couple subtraction modification and the child and dependent care expenses subtraction modifications for households 3 through 6. We've assumed that households 1 through 4 elect the standard deduction on the federal income tax return for tax year 2025, and households 5 and 6 claim federal itemized deductions totaling $60,000 and $90,000 respectively for tax year 2025. And we've also assumed that households 5 and 6 have net capital gain for tax year 2025, totaling $100,000 and $250,000 respectively, and that the full amount of each gain is subject to the proposed 1% surtax. And as you can see from the chart, households 1 through 4 see modest reductions in state and local income tax liability as a result of the proposed changes, and households 5 and 6 see increases in their state and local income tax liability. The local income tax change column of the chart shows a range of the local income tax effect based on the minimum and maximum local income tax rates. Of the example households shown, households 5 and 6 see the largest change in income tax liability in dollar amount terms. Household 1 sees the largest change in income tax liability as a percentage of federal adjusted gross income. Assuming that all of household 1's earned income is earned income and that this taxpayer claims the Maryland Earned Income Tax Credit in accordance with current law, household 1 pays no state or local income tax regardless of these proposed changes, but they realize an increased refund under the refundable component of the state's Earned Income Tax Credit due to the decrease in pre-credit tax liability. Note that none of the example households shown here are affected by the proposed changes to the state's child tax credit, as these changes would fully phase out the credit for taxpayers with federal adjusted gross income exceeding $24,000.
Package as we proceed in the session. Teresa Jasinski is going to take over and talk to you about the economy and state revenues.
Thank you. If we turn to page 14, we'll start by talking about the economy. The chart on page 14 gives you kind of a broad look at how the Maryland economy has been performing in calendar 2024 by focusing on basically 3 measures. Income, both total personal income and wage and salary income, as well as gross domestic product. Gross domestic product or gross state product is the broad measure of economic activity in the state. In each of these measures, the underlying measure is in dollars, And often when we look at dollar valued metrics, it's important to adjust for inflation. So for each measure, you'll see two columns, one for nominal and one for adjusted for inflation. This data is only available quarterly, and we have data through the first 3 quarters of the calendar year 2024. They're listed on the far left column, January through March, April through June, July through September. And we're showing you the year-over-year growth rate from the quarter in 2024 to the same quarter in 2023. The rows in the middle of the table look at the entire year-to-date performance, so the first 9 months of the year, July through September, January through September of 2024, to the same period in 2023. Maryland personal income is up 5.8% through the first 3 quarters of 2024. Wage income was up 6.2%, and the gross domestic product for the state was up 5.3%. We've shown you the U.S. growth over the same time period, and you can see Maryland is tracking the U.S. growth very closely. In the case of income, it's actually slightly above. But we do trail growth in Virginia, and Virginia is outpacing the U.S. economy as a whole. Adjusted for inflation, inflation, of course, had gotten quite high. It has come down considerably. Inflation in 2024, as measured by the U.S. Consumer Price Index, was 3%. That's down from 4.1% in calendar 2023 and 8% in calendar 2022. Adjusted for inflation, Maryland personal income was up 2.7% through the first 9 months of 2024, and wage income was up 3.1%. As a point of comparison, in 2023, inflation-adjusted wage income in Maryland was up just 1.1%. So this has been a significant improvement in real wage growth for Marylanders. The last rows on this table take a longer-term view, comparing those first 9 months of 2024 to the first 9 months of 2019, of course, the last year before the pandemic began. One thing to note is that Maryland has experienced growth over this time period. Inflation-adjusted gross domestic product for the state is up 7.4% over this 5-year period. As a point of comparison, if you look at the 5 years before the pandemic began, 2019 over 2014, Maryland's inflation-adjusted gross state product had grown 8.7%. But in this case, we are trailing growth for the U.S. economy as a whole by a significant amount. You can see the U.S. growth below the Maryland line. And once again, we see that Virginia has been outpacing the growth of the U.S. economy. Now, overall, the Maryland economy is doing quite well in 2024. But if we go to the next page, and we'll just hit on what something Dave already mentioned, which is a significant risk to the Maryland economy, and that has to do with the federal government and potential changes of the new administration with regard to federal employment as well as federal spending. There are about 160,000 civilian federal jobs located in the state of Maryland. About 12,000 of those are in the Postal Service. That number does not include civilian workers at the National Security Agency. It is a classified agency, and so their employment count is also classified. Even outside of the National Security Agency, a lot of those jobs are in the national security area. But we have about 45,000 civilian jobs in the Department of Defense in Maryland and the various service branches, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. Other major agencies are Health and Human Services, where there's about 40,000 jobs in Maryland. The bulk of those are at NIH and the Food and Drug Administration. There's also about 13,000 jobs in the Department of Commerce in Maryland. But it's not just about the direct jobs located in the state. Of course, a lot of Marylanders commute to federal jobs in the district and in Virginia, and each of those jurisdictions have about 190,000 federal civilian jobs. To get a picture of the overall impact of federal employment on Maryland, the Comptroller's Office looked at tax year 2021 data and identified every taxpayer who had a W-2 from the federal government, meaning that they had gotten wage income from the federal government in tax year 2021. That worked out to be about 8% of all Maryland taxpayers. They had, in total, about $24 billion of federal wages, and that accounted for about 12% of total wages reported in federal adjusted gross income for Maryland residents in 2021. If you do a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation applying an effective tax rate, that $24 billion of wages supports about $1 billion, roughly, of Maryland personal income, state personal income, and about $700 million of local income tax. It's not just about direct federal employees, of course. The federal spending has a big effect on the Maryland economy through the private sector. There's a lot of federal contract spending. In federal fiscal year 2023, federal contract spending for work performed in Maryland was about $42 billion, and that equates to about 10% of private sector gross state product. And as David also mentioned earlier, obviously the state budget itself is dependent on federal dollars. There's about $20 billion of federal funds in the fiscal 2026 allowance. If we go to the next page and move on to revenues, we're going to start with the fiscal 2024 closeout. Fiscal 2024, of course, ended last June, and this chart compares it to the actual revenues to the estimate. In total, general fund revenues exceeded the estimate in fiscal 2024 by $217 million. The growth was 0.9% over fiscal 2023, but there were pretty substantial one-time items in both years. And if we look at ongoing revenues, it was 1%. I'm sorry, the growth rate in total was 5% and 1% ongoing. By far the largest source of general fund revenues is the personal income tax. That was slightly below the estimate in fiscal 2023. Both withholding and quarterly estimated payments were below the estimate, although there was an overattainment on final payments received from tax returns. Growth was 1.1% over fiscal 2023. The corporate income tax exceeded the estimate by $131 million. It grew 4.8% over fiscal 23. There was an increase in the share of corporate revenues going to the Transportation Trust Fund between those 2 years, so that does affect the general fund growth rate. In total, gross receipts in the corporate income tax were up 8.2%. That's the 6th consecutive year we have seen growth in corporate gross receipts taxes. Refunds were up 10%, but they remain at historically low levels. The general fund sales tax was also slightly below the estimate. It actually fell 1.8% over 2023. There was an increase in the share of the sales tax going to the Blueprint Fund in 2024. It increased from 9.2% in fiscal 23 to 11% in fiscal 2024. If we look at total gross receipts in the sales tax, they were up just 0.8%. But 2024 was the first year of the cannabis tax. And if we take out the cannabis tax, gross receipts actually fell 0.2% in 2024. I'll note that the cannabis revenue did exceed estimate by about $28 million in total, and that generated about $12 million extra for the general fund. Among the other revenue sources, there was substantial overattainment in the interest earnings as well as the insurance premium tax. There was overattainment in miscellaneous revenues due largely to one-time items, including unclaimed property. But there was underattainment in the alcohol and tobacco taxes and in the estate and inheritance taxes. If we move on to page 17, and we'll just look at the general fund forecast. The Board of Revenue Estimates put out a general fund forecast in September, and then they updated that forecast in December, and this chart is comparing the December estimate to the September forecast for both fiscal 2025 and 2026. The BRE revised up the fiscal 2025 estimate by $194 million, or 0.8%. It is projecting growth of 1.6% in total and 2.2% ongoing revenues. The vast majority of the upward revision was in the personal income tax, and this was driven almost entirely by an upward revision to withholding, which had been coming in well year to date. I will say that the great majority of all these revisions are related to aligning the estimate with year-to-date performance. The underlying economic outlook for the BRE has not really changed in December relative to their September forecast. There was small adjustments to the corporate income tax and the sales tax, and the insurance premium tax, but there was a significant reduction to the tobacco tax, which has been underperforming in the wake of the recent tax increase. In fiscal 2026, there is a technical adjustment to the lottery that generated $24 million in general fund revenues. This results from pushing out by 1 year the beginning of needing lottery revenues for debt service as it relates to redeveloping Camden Yards Baseball Stadium in Baltimore. I also note there's a significant drop in tobacco tax revenue in 2026, 19%. This relates to legislation, the BRFA actually last year, which began a distribution to the Blueprint Fund of tobacco tax revenue. That is fixed at $88 million in fiscal 2025, but it goes to I believe it's 32.6% in fiscal 2026, so that blueprint distribution will go from $88 million in fiscal 25 to $142 million in fiscal 2026. Now, the BRE did not carry forward into 2026 the upward revisions to the income tax, the personal income tax, and the sales tax. And they did not do this because of that risk of the federal government changes related to the workforce, related to spending. Given the great uncertainty about what is going to happen and the importance of the federal workforce to the Maryland economy, they thought it was prudent to at this time not put. Normally they would have carried forward those upward revisions, but they chose not to do that here in order to be prudent about the forecast and the risks that exist, and we at this time don't know exactly what is going to happen. So, and that concludes my section.
We're going to turn to the operating budget, and Tanya Zimmerman, our operating budget manager, will present.
So beginning on page 18, we're beginning the budget discussion with a look at the deficiency appropriations proposed for fiscal 2025. This first page looks at the total fund deficiencies, and these are net of some planned reversions that are included in the budget. So those total about $2.9 billion. Over $1 billion of these deficiencies are related to entitlements. Over $830 million of that is related to Medicaid, including behavioral health related Medicaid, but there is also deficiency appropriations for both foster care and assistance payments, as well as the tax credits. About $749 million is related to the Developmental Disabilities Administration. That is net of some cost containment actions. And then there's two bars related to fiscal 2024 costs. Those are both kind of shortfalls in the expenditures for which there's funding provided, about $555 million, as well as about $162 million related to reversions that were made in error, including related to some PAYGO funds, as well as in the Department of Human Services. But there is $75 million of federal funds that are related to reversion and error in prior years. If you turn to the next page, this looks at the general fund deficiencies in particular. These total about $1.5 billion. Again, the largest area is in Medicaid. So the entitlements overall are about 618, more than 500 million of the general funds are Medicaid. And then the next two bars relate to cost containment. And this chart, it separates out the growth in the Developmental Disabilities Administration with the cost containment actions. The cost containment actions reduced the spending that would have been needed by about $97 million. If you turn to the next page, page 20, this looks at the change in the spending between fiscal 2025 and 2026. Those are the lines. The bars represent the share of the different areas of the budgets that are composed of the different fund sources. Overall, you can see in most areas the growth is between about 4 and 5%, and this largely has to do with the funds related to fiscal 2025. COLA and increments are budgeted within the Department of Budget and Management at this point, but in 2026, those are out into the different agencies' budgets, and so that leads to growth pretty consistently across areas. Just a couple areas with some differences. The Human Services area increases by 8.6%. There's a significant growth in the funding for energy assistance that is contributing to that. The health is a much lower percentage of growth, and that is, again, heavily influenced by the cost containment actions in the Developmental Disabilities Administration. And the other education actually declines slightly, and this is influenced by something like the child care scholarship, the freeze and enrollment that was discussed earlier. If you turn to the next page, this focuses on the general fund change in the fiscal 2026 allowance. As was noted earlier, it actually decreases by $274 million. The areas of growth include entitlements, about $180 million, of which $140 million is Medicaid, including behavioral health related Medicaid. Local aid increases by a net of $70 million. This is primarily driven by the teacher and community college retirement that is partially offset by the cost, by the shifting in the some of the costs to the local governments. These are offset by some areas of decline, including reduced general fund costs related to debt service, as well as about $268 million of prior year expenses, and about $116 million of PAYGO funding, including some one-time costs and some shifting of expenses to the capital budget. The next chart looks specifically at the state agency spending. This increases by a net of about $13 million, but there's quite a number of kind of ups and downs related to that. The largest area of increase relates to the COLA and increments. There's about $120 million of initiatives. These include things like the $25 million to capitalize the Sunny Day Fund, an increase of about $23 million for the Enough Act. There's some funding, about $10 million for the Strategic Infrastructure Revolving Loan Fund that was created in legislation last session. These areas are offset by a number of activities that include the $50 million in anticipated efficiency savings, some one-time settlement costs, and the additional kind of cost containment actions for the Developmental Disability Administration and the one-time support for WMATA. Page 23 begins kind of a detailed description of the actions that are in the BRFA. Just going to hit some of the highlights because you've heard some of them before. So you've heard about most of the revenue actions. There's one I would mention, which is about $65 million of interest from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund. Last year's BRFA redirected interest from a number of special funds to the general fund. At the time, that fund was exempted from that, and this removes that exemption and directs the interest to the general fund. There's about $470 million of revenue actions related to NDOT, which you'll hear more about later, and you've heard about the most significant of the transfers. The next few pages provide a detailed list of the general fund reductions that are contingent mostly on the BRFA. There are a couple related to other legislation, ones that have special funds that are kind of a component, so they're effectively fund swaps, are denoted with an asterisk. You've heard about a number of the larger items. Towards the bottom of page 24, there's a couple items that are related to the Developmental Disabilities Administration. A number of the cost containment actions do not require legislation, but there are three of the areas that do, including expanding the uses of the waitlist equity fund, which is producing one-time savings to be replaced with special funds, modifying the self-directed services, and on the top of the next page, there's an action related to eliminating the low-intensity support services. There's some additional expansions of special fund uses, including the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Base 2010 Trust Fund, the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, and MEMSOF, which are some of the larger of those fund swaps. If you turn to page 26, towards the bottom of that page, there is a list of actions that are special fund reductions that are also contingent on legislation. Some of those are related to the blueprint and not in the BRFA. There are a few additional items. So the cigarette restitution fund is experiencing some revenue shortfalls, and so there's two actions in the BRFA to eliminate the mandate for the statewide academic health centers, as well as to begin a phase out of the funding for the Tri-County Council for Southern Maryland. There are a number of other items listed throughout. I will note when you get to the contingent special fund appropriations, those are just additional special fund appropriations. So for things like the changes related to MDE related fees, there is a list in Appendix 19 of some of those kind of areas of general fund reduction that are backfilled with special funds in the budget. And that concludes what I have for you.
Moving on. State personnel, Jacob Cash, our analyst.
Hello, everybody. On page 30, you can see an analysis of executive branch vacancies and the turnover rate. This is including the new positions added in the fiscal 2026 allowance. The actual vacancy rate is just above 10% currently. If you remember from the Spending Affordability Committee meeting in the fall, the vacancy rate was at 10.4%, so there has been a slight reduction this past quarter. However, according to this budget, there is still room to reduce vacancies by about 1,300. Overall, there's about 5,300 vacancies as of January, and most of these are in the public safety, health, and human services agencies. They have the highest budgeted turnover, and the overall budgeted turnover for the state is 7.5%. That's lower than the 8% in 2025. However, as I just mentioned, we expect that they will not meet that according to current vacancies. On page 31, there is a chart showing the historical and currently budgeted salary increases. As David mentioned at the beginning, there is a 1% general salary increase as well as increments provided for employees. In 2025, you can also see that there was about 1% increase, increments that were provided to those who have been in service since before June 30th, 2019. Moving on to page 32, this shows new positions in the budget. There are a lot of contractual conversions, and this is mostly a retention initiative, so there's less added cost when a contractual position is converted to a regular position compared to a completely new position. However, there are a numerous amount of these across all of state government. Most of these are in comptroller as well as DNR and Department of the Environment. There are also several new positions added related to existing initiatives, including 92 new positions added to the Maryland Transit Administration to improve reliability of their services. And this is half of the new positions. Half were added last year, half added this year. There's also 78 new positions added to MTA for their police for patrolling the Purple Line. And there's also 125 new positions added to the Department of Labor for their Division of Unemployment Insurance, and 26 new positions added to increase the position allotment for the Department of Service and Civic Innovation. Moving on to page 33 for retirement and pensions, there is about $185 million increase in the state's retirement spending in fiscal 2026. There are actually some balancing reductions. As you can see in this chart, the administration is proposing to repeal the pension reinvestment mandate, which would save $50 million this year and moving forward each year, as well as reducing the state's share of the teachers' combined plans, totaling $97.7 million in reductions. The BRFA also, as introduced, eliminates the $25 million additional payment, which would have been added to the accumulation of funds account for the pension system. There's been upward pressure for a number of reasons. As you know, there's been a pandemic and much larger inflation than historically assumed. The actuarial assumptions actually did increase to account slightly for this by 25 basis points. But even with that increase, the actual payroll growth was much higher than the assumptions. The investment returns for fiscal 2024 were higher than the assumption. However, the smoothed over rate, which is what is used to determine the contribution rate, was slightly lower. So that contributed as well to the increase in costs. But with that, that's all I have prepared for you right now. I'll move on.
We're moving on to state aid to local governments. Hiram Birch.
On page 35, you can see that state aid to local governments is projected to total $11.4 billion in fiscal 2026. This represents a $601 million or 5.6% increase over the prior year. Public schools continue to receive the vast majority of state aid, with state funding totaling $9.6 billion. This represents a $554 million increase over the prior year. Funding for county and municipal governments will total $1 billion, representing a $14.4 million increase. Community colleges will receive $500 million, a $22.5 million increase over the prior year. Libraries will receive $100.5 million, for a $4.3 million increase, and local health departments will receive $117 million, representing a $5.8 million increase. Page 36 shows state funding by major programs. You can see that education aid under the targeted formula programs increased by a significant amount in FY26. In particular, state funding for the Concentration of Poverty Grant, which is one of the blueprint programs, increases by $129.3 million, or 35.6%. Funding for full-day pre-kindergarten, another blueprint program, increases by $37.8 million, or 28%. State aid under the foundation program increases by $133.4 million, or 3.4%. The English Language Learners Grant increases by 4.9%, resulting in $25.2 million in additional state support. The Special Education Formula Program increases by 11%, resulting in $58.5 million in additional support. The Compensatory Aid Program, which is based on the free and reduced price meal count, increases by $32 million, or 1.9%. State funding for teachers' retirement increases by $62 million, which is a 6.8% increase. Turning to community colleges, funding under the CAID formula increases by $16.9 million. This represents a 4.4% increase in student enrollment and a 0.4% increase in the per-student grant amount. As stated earlier, funding for local health grants will increase by $5.8 million, which represents additional state support to cover salary enhancement for local health department employees. At the county and municipal level, transportation aid increases by $52.8 million, or 12.4%, and this mostly reflects the continuing phase-in of increased funding share under the Local Highway User Revenue Program. And FY26 funding to local governments is based on 20% of total GMVRA revenues. Under current law, these distributions will remain the same for FY27, but beginning in FY28, the allocations will revert back to the FY24 distributions, which is 15.6%. Public safety aid increases by $3.1 million, or 1.5%. This increase is partly due to a $1.5 million increase under the Senator Amos Fire Aid Program, with funding increasing from $15 million to $16.5 million due to legislation passed at the 2024 session. State funding for police aid will total $75.9 million, with the state budget also including $45.9 million in enhanced funding for the police aid program. This is the fourth year that this enhanced funding has been provided to local governments. This funding is based on each jurisdiction's share of total violent offenses. The state budget also includes $47.5 million in targeted crime grants. The disparity grant program is decreasing by $11.9 million, and this is due to the narrowing of the income disparities among local jurisdictions. You can see that the other county grants are decreasing by $30.5 million, and this reflects a $10 million decrease in voting systems grants due to a postponement in the upgrades for a new system. It also includes $5 million decrease due to the phase-out of behavioral health crisis response grants since the statutory funding stopped in fiscal 2025. Finally, the BRFA includes a $13.8 million reductions to the Teachers Retirement Supplemental Grant Program, and it also includes a $1 million reductions to warrants and the absconding program. Page 37 provides two maps that shows the amount of state aid provided to local governments on a per capita basis and also as a percent change basis. Turning to page 38, it shows detail of the proposed contingent reductions to local funding and the BRFA. In total, state funding to local governments is projected to decrease by $283.4 million. Funding for public schools will be reduced by $242.9 million. This includes two contingent reductions through the BRFA, which will result in a cost shift to local governments. One is a $25 million reduction to non-public placements, and the second is a $92.9 million reduction to teachers' retirement payments. In addition, the BRFA includes a $122.4 million reduction to the Collaborative Learning Initiative, which will affect several formula aid programs. This reduction will result in a 1.8% reduction in the per pupil funding amount under the Foundation Compensatory and English Language Learners Program. Funding for community colleges will decrease by $4.8 million, and funding for county governments will decrease by $14.8 million. In addition, county governments will be expected to assume a larger portion of property assessment costs. Currently, these costs are split 50-50, but under the BRFA provision, county governments will assume 90% of the cost. This will require local governments to pay an additional $20.9 million. Of the $283.4 million in the total funding reductions to local governments, nearly one-half of them represents a state-local cost shift, whereby the local governments will be required to assume the cost for the program in lieu of state support. This includes the $92.9 million for teachers' retirement, the $25 million for non-public placements, and a $4.8 million reduction in community college retirement, and a $20.9 million in assessment cost. In addition, there is a $32.5 million reduction for local retirement related to the retirement reinvestment provision. Of this amount, $30.7 million is for teachers' retirement, around $500,000 for libraries, and $1.3 million for community colleges. Local governments will not be required to offset these reductions. Now, while these proposed reductions will affect local finances, it's important to realize that local governments are still projected to receive a 5.6% increase in their state funding in fiscal 2026, and this percent increase is higher than the annual growth rate in the current budget, which is 4.8% for fiscal 2025. In addition, due to the continuing increase in property assessments, which have remained fairly strong over the past 3 years, most county governments should realize moderate increases in their property tax revenue in both fiscal 2025 and 2026. In Maryland, property assessments are done once every 3 years, with 1/3 of the property within a county being reassessed in any given year. As shown on page 39, property reassessments for 2023 increased on average by 20.6%. with reassessments averaging 23.4% in 24 and 20.1% in 25. For the current fiscal year, 2025, property tax collections for county governments are projected to be over $1 billion higher than the audited amounts in fiscal 2023. This represents a $500 million annual increase in revenues over the 2-year period. As shown on page 40, due to the rise in property tax assessments, county governments are able to collect a significant higher amount of revenues, even without raising the property tax rates. Only 4 counties increased property tax rates in fiscal 25. This page shows that county governments were able to raise approximately $440 million in revenues by having property tax rates set above the constant yield. Due to the most recent property assessments, it is projected that county governments will be able to once again generate in fiscal 2026 at least the same increase in property tax revenues that they did in fiscal 2024 and 2025. And that concludes the local aid section.
So 2 topics left. The first is transportation, and Steve McCulloch.
Thank you. Looking at page 41, this table shows that, as you recall, last session, there were some significant revenue increases included in the budget as passed. Those totaled over the 6-year forecast period from 2025 through 2030. It's expected to bring in $1.8 billion. As has been mentioned, the BRFA, as introduced, includes an additional revenue increases for transportation, totaling $470 million in 2026, and then $420 million ongoing thereafter. Dave Romans mentioned the largest being the retail delivery fee at 75 cents per delivery, generates about $225 million per year. I would note that the BRFA also has some non-fiscal related provisions. One is to increase, because of these new revenues, the amount of debt outstanding from consolidated transportation bonds from $4.5 billion to $5 billion. The last time that was increased was back in 2013. It adds one eligible use for Garvey bonds, and it eliminates an operating budget planning increase that's currently required, and it also delays zero-emission bus purchase requirements until 2034. Now, page 42, the chart shows of this $4 billion between the 2 years of new revenue, how does that get spent? The first 3 bars are decreases in revenues, the largest one being the motor fuel tax compared to last year's forecast is lower in the new forecast. There's a lower starting balance, and also the last of the COVID funding that supported transportation occurred in last forecast. There is no COVID funding assumed in any of the years of the current forecast. Then the 2 bars on the right show increased spending. The largest increases in the operating expenses, takes about 51% of the increase, and then capital budget spending increases as well by just over $1 billion. And you can see that on page 43, which looks at the consolidated transportation plan comparison last year to the current plan. Total change increases by about $1.1 billion. This is a significant departure from the September forecast, when that draft forecast had a $1.9 billion decrease in capital spending. So it's important to note that that $1.2 billion increase is dependent on those new revenues that are assumed in the forecast. Turning to page 44, this just lays out the changes between last year's CTP and the current year CTP, and you can see that while most of the modes in the department do see increases year to year, State Highway does see just over $575 million decrease between the 2 programs. That concludes the transportation.
Last but not least, Matthew Klein with the capital budget.
Thank you, David. If you turn to page 45, this begins a section on the capital budget program. This chart reflects the fiscal 26 budget as proposed and compares that to the fiscal 25 budget, and also includes a column for what was planned in the CIP for fiscal 2026. As you can see from the total, is a little over $3,067 million. This compares to the $3.36 billion in fiscal 2025, so it's a reduction of about $292 million. Most of this reduction is seen in reduced federal funds, also in changes in the issuance stream for the Built to Learn program. If you combine general funds with the bond premiums and the general obligation bond, or the general funds and the general obligation bond funds, there's ostensibly no difference in the fiscal 26 program compared to the fiscal 2025. The Spending Affordability Committee had recommended a $1.75 billion new GO bond authorization level. The administration's budget is at $1.75 million of new GO bond authorizations, consistent with the Spending Affordability Committee recommendation. It does allow for some additional spending from recycled funds from prior years, which are deauthorized in the capital budget bill. Last year, there was about $95 million in the final budget. This year, the budget is introduced as about $65 million, so there's a slight reduction there, but that allows for the total net new authorizations to be about $1.815 billion, again, within the Spending Affordability Committee recommendation limit. Bond premiums are proposed in the budget this year. $140 million are authorized in the capital budget bill. This is a significant difference from what was funded in fiscal 2025. This is comprised of $50 million of bond premiums that have already been received from the June 2024 sale, and another $90 million estimated from the June 2025 sale. There's also another $5 million from the June 2024 sale, which is being brought in as a deficiency appropriation to round that number out. General funds ostensibly remain low after a couple of years of significant general fund pay-go spending. 140 million, or excuse me, 41 million is proposed in fiscal 2026. Much of this is for miscellaneous grants, part of the administration's economic package. This compares to 145 million for fiscal 2025. The fiscal 2025 number does, however, include about 35 million of proposed deficiencies to replace funds that were inadvertently reverted at closeout from both fiscal 2022 and 2023. Special funds in the budget are about 66 million more than what was funded last year. There are some reductions in revenues from the transfer tax, but this is made up with additional special fund revenues that account for 42 million from the Prince George's County for the P3 for Built to Learn, as those are now being budgeted into the fund. The budget does include another 9.1 million of special funds from fiscal responsibility, which are going to be used to support the school construction program, and another 9 million is being proposed from the BCCC fund balance to fund facility renewal projects on the campus. Federal funds decrease in the budget, relatively large increase. Most of this is reflected in about 172 million that was funded for the broadband initiative in fiscal 2025 to complete the state's federal funding for that, which is not renewed in fiscal 2026 as those funds have been received. And there's also a cancellation of federal funds for the new veterans home. This is a project that we're looking into now. The state did not receive the federal award for this. So the federal funds that were proposed to be spent in this budget in fiscal 26 will not materialize at this point. If you turn to page 46, this gives you the same perspective comparing the budgets from 25 to what's being proposed for 26. This looks at the various uses of those funds. The four largest areas of funding remain education, environment, higher education, and housing. The budget proposed by the administration meets the $450 million anticipated funding level that the legislature sought for school construction, with the addition of the 9.1 million of special funds from the Fiscal Responsibility Fund. That rounds that out to 450 million. Much of the rest of the funding for education program is the Built to Learn funds, which again are roughly over 330 million is proposed to be issued in fiscal 2026. The environment is the second largest component of the budget. Much of this is special funds, around 332 million of this is special funds, and another 181 is federal funds, and only about 52 million is GO bond funds. This goes ostensibly to fund the water quality and drinking water loan programs, various programs that support the Bay Restoration Fund, as well as program open space, including Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Program. Higher education receives $475 million, which is an increase of about 109 million relative to fiscal 2025, but is consistent with what was proposed in the CIP from last year, as some large projects are coming forward with anticipated construction funding that will be seen this year. And then lastly, housing is the fourth largest component. About 390 million of this is for the Department of Housing and Community Development. As it was mentioned earlier, the budget does include $50 million of legislative initiative funding that the governor has earmarked. Of the 232 million of local projects, 50 million is for that. And there's another 52 million of pre-authorized projects that the legislature pre-authorized last year that are included in the budget this year. If you turn to the next page, a significant component of the administration's overall budget plan includes the transfer of about $196 million of prior year general fund authorizations, much of which that are in the dedicated purpose account. About 114 million is proposed to be transferred from the dedicated purpose account, with about 40 million of that being proposed to be replaced. The biggest component that is not being replaced is the new veterans home that I mentioned earlier. Since that project is canceled, the state funds that were previously appropriated for this purpose are being swept up to the general fund and are not proposed to be replaced, as well as another $82 million of other proposed reversions for projects that received general funds in prior years, and those funds can be used to support the general fund. About $81 million of that is being proposed to be replaced for projects that are ongoing, but the general funds are not needed to move those projects forward in fiscal 2026. There's about $60 million of PAYGO funds that remain in the dedicated purpose account following those transfers from the 2023 and 2024 PAYGO appropriations to the dedicated purpose account. And there's several appendices which begin on page 75, which support some other concepts in the capital program. And that's what I have.
Mr. Chairman, that completes our presentation. We are happy to answer any questions the committees have.
Thank you, Mr. Romans. Thank you for you and your whole team for doing another great analysis of everything that we've got before us. Members, our system is not up at the moment in terms of being able to push the button and us being able to recognize you. So we'll need you to raise your hand, and we'll do our best to take you in order, such that it is. So anyone who has a question, please raise your hand. Senator Saw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the information. I just want to get back to the governor's car tax proposal. If we could talk about this for a moment, please. I just have a couple of quick questions. I appreciate that. Thank you. Can you just explain the governor's tax proposal? Is it limited, true that it's limited to car sales of at least 15,000 or less? And how many cars are 15,000 or less on that?
According to the information that MDOT has proposed at this point, they're saying that 40% of the transactions currently are for vehicles, which would be used vehicles. I'm not sure there are any more new vehicles that meet that price level.
Thank you. Just one more question if I could, Mr. Chairman. How does the trade-in repeal affect lease customers or others who may buy cars frequently?
We have not dug into those numbers yet, but we'll be evaluating the BRFA, come up with that kind of answer.
I appreciate that. If I get that information, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair, I just have two questions. One is higher ed and one is K through 12. Thank you for the information. A lot to digest very quickly. We're very appreciative. My first question is related to, I think it's on page 10, related to U of M spending. I know that there is a protected 1% merit increase. I wanted to know if that's reflective of the 1% that was negotiated with the system in AFSCME. Is that inclusive of or separate from?
My understanding is that there's 1% COLA for all state employees, including the higher ed employees.
Okay, thank you so much. And my second question is related to, I think it's page 26 as it relates to the approximately $124 million in proposed savings related to reduced spending on the collaborative teaching time, the delay of the implementation thereof. Of that $124 million, my understanding that impacts the foundation formula. So if we were to break out that $124 million based on how does this impact compensatory education spending, how does it impact language learners, and then also special ed. If we broke out that 124, how did those three, how are they impacted?
We have that. I don't have that with me, so but we'll get back to you with that information.
Okay. I'm just noodling around. And so if that's approximately $30 million of comp ed that's hit, it seems like it might be closer to $70 million of true collaborative teaching time. That might be the target more than $124 million. Just something to, I'd love to talk with you offline, but I just want to make sure people know that that proposal would, impact our most vulnerable and needy learners and students. Thank you so much.
Just wondering whether you found in the budget funding for the Register of Wills offices.
Still digging through the details of the budget. I understand that, I mean, under current law, the inheritance tax is a significant funding source for the registers of wills, and it appears that it was just repealed. So I'm not sure that there's funding, but we haven't looked under every nook and cranny yet.
So are you aware of how much that would be if we had to backfill that?
I believe it's in the range of 20 million.
I think it's a little higher, maybe 35.
Well, again, we're looking into
Okay,
some of these
thank you.
details.
The proposed budget shifts some of the costs for the teacher pensions to the counties and some costs related to public placement for students receiving special education, the non-public placements. Is that non-public placement shift to the county or to the local school systems?
The non-public placement costs would be to the local school systems.
Okay, so can you tell me how either of those shifts are accounted for as it relates to the minimum school funding requirement or the maintenance of effort funding?
I don't think we've finished all of our analysis on the local, the MOE and that side of things, but we'll certainly be looking at that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the DLS staff that are here today, and I see members of the governor's administration here today as well. I want to commend Governor Moore on this this beginning of our budget process here. I see that we are shifting quite a bit down to our local jurisdictions, and you know, neither in support or against that, but it is a hope, really speaking to the body here, that we can empower our counties to have another tool in the toolbox that's not just raising property taxes. Isn't that so? Sorry, I know I'm supposed to be asking you a question, but it's rare that you get this illustrious group of people in one room. So I just wanted to make sure that we lifted up our counties and our localities as well today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for this helpful information. I just wanted to ask two quick questions going back to the inheritance tax for a minute. The first one is, what is the total amount of lost revenue associated with repealing the inheritance tax? And the second is, do you have a sense of folks that pay that tax? What percentage of them are Maryland residents versus what percentage are out-of-state folks that pay the inheritance tax to us?
I looked at a couple of years ago's inheritance tax, and it was in the, I want to say, $60 to $70 million range that came to the state after the distributions for registers of wills and so forth. I don't think we've taken the deep dive that you're looking for in your second question yet into the inheritance tax.
For being here today. I want to come back to the cars for just a moment if we can. I sold cars for 27 years, and it's interesting to me. Well, let me ask this first question first. So you explained so I really want to get it in my mind. Can you explain the governor's car tax proposal, and is it true that it's limited to the sale of cars at $15,000 or less?
That is correct. That is the proposal that the administration has put forward.
The reason I asked, and you said 40% of the sales were 15,000, right?
I said that's what the Department of Transportation has indicated.
Mr. McCullough, just to clarify, I think it's 15,000 or more, right?
No, the proposal is that the trade-in tax would only apply
to the vehicle.
for vehicle purchases of 15,000 or less. So if you bought a vehicle, a used vehicle that was $15,001, there would be no trade-in allowance for any value of the car you were trading in.
What happens there is the consumer gets burned. I think you really need to go back and look at that 40%. As I said, I was in the car business for 27 years, and I could probably count on my hands how many cars I traded in for $15,000. Even at that, you get a $15,000 vehicle, you got to make $1. but used cars make more money on the car lots than new cars. So I think you need to really go back and look at this. Well, let me ask you another question. Will all the money be raised from this tax increase and last year's registration fees be used for roads and bridges? And how much is that going to be used to support the transit as well?
As you saw in one of the exhibits, in terms of where the funding is going, there was about a $2 billion increase over the 5 years in the operating expense spending across the department, which about equaled last year's revenue increase. Well, yes, it's all planning, right? So we've got fiscal 2026 is the budget year that we'll be
concerned about the $15,000 trade-in for 40% of the vehicles.
So that is a $225 million per year revenue estimate. If that proposal does not go forward, there will need to be $225 million of spending in the forecast to come out.
I'm just trying to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here, and Mr. Romans, thank you for the amazing analysis so quickly. Just a quick question on the child care enrollment pause. Do you have data compared to the baseline of what we expected absent the changes in the budget? We're capping the enrollment at 42,000, the number of families that would have been projected to enroll under the child care scholarship without the pause?
I don't have it with me. I can get you that. I think overall we had significantly higher enrollment in our baseline forecast than that, but we'll get you the precise number.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for your analysis. I had a question about the Child Victims Act impending settlements, which seems like could throw a real wrench in this great start that Delegate Ivey has referred to. And just for clarification and for the record, I do not represent any members of that class of people. But I did want to know, is there any additional information that we could have that might kind of give us a jump start on this potential additional funds that are going to be needed to resolve this very serious situation, whether there's any kind of tiered structure that the Attorney General's office is thinking about in resolving these matters, whether you can give us kind of a low end or maybe a middle end, because it looks like several zeros, if you look at the cap, that could ultimately end up throwing, like I said, a huge wrench in our plans here to balance this budget.
As I said, there's negotiations going on between the state and the plaintiffs. I don't know precisely where they are, so it's very hard to put a dollar amount on what you might see in terms of this year's budget. You're correct that if you do all the multiplication, the potential liability is enormous. My understanding is in other settlements in other places, they have had sort of different tranches depending on the seriousness of the abuse that occurred. And I think that is certainly one of the considerations that's going on in the negotiations.
As soon as we can get more information, I know that all of us would love to be able to kind of crunch that and put our heads together, because that's, like I said, I think it's going to be a very big situation once it comes to bear. Thank you very much, Mr. Romans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, DLS team, for your thorough analysis. I have questions related to the Medicaid and DDA spending cost containment measures. So specifically, I'm pretty concerned about the potential impact on beneficiaries in both sides of those cost containment efforts. So can you share a little bit more information to the extent that you know it? And I know we'll get into it in subcommittee as well, about sort of how the cost containment efforts in DDA would be implemented for this fiscal year. It says 97 million for the current and 235 for FY26. And then similarly, I see that in Medicaid, the largest portion of cost containment is coming from the hospital deficit assessment. Are there any other cost containment efforts in Medicaid outside of the DDA proposals that you'll illustrate? Thank you.
The Medicaid budget is very large and voluminous, so I can't say for sure that there's no other cost containment, but the only major cost containment that we have identified, the only one in the BRFA on Medicaid is the hospital deficit assessment, but there may be some other smaller actions going on in the budget, and we will certainly be going over that with a fine-tooth comb. The DDA, I mean, there's a whole mixture of proposed actions in both the current year and in 26. I think we are still getting our heads around on exactly how they all work. I mean, one of the ones in the current year that's very simple is the 15 million accessing the waiting list equity fund to pay some of DDA's costs rather than general funds. So 15 of the 97 million is just a fund swap, doesn't have any adverse immediate impact on providers or clients. I think the other combination of things seem to be partly directed at self-directed care, putting more controls on that program, and some of the other things are just going to result in lower payments to providers for certain specific types of adjustments in their provider rates. But again, there's a number of actions, and they're all very technical, so we are digging into fully understanding those, and we will definitely present more to you once we get it further into the process.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, everyone, for the work that you have done. But I do have a question regarding the cut to the Tri-County Council regarding SMATIC over the next 4 years. And I know that's a $1 million appropriation that is the direct impact to our farmers in the 5 Southern Maryland counties. And I know that that money has been coming from the Cigarette Restitution Fund. And I know the Department of Agriculture, along with SMATIC, has used that money in the past and is turning that around at least 3 to 1. And we've done projects through the Tri-County Council to support many areas of the state. And in conversations with the Secretary of Agriculture, their intention was to take what we were doing in the Tri-County Council and reinvent that to help the farmers in all of the other areas. And it sort of strikes me surprising when we're talking about the cigarette restitution money and when we're actually taking something and using this as an economic driver for a group of people that lost their entire income from the work that we did here, why we would at all look at this, and I would hope that we would reconsider. But I'd definitely like to hear your comments.
I'm not sure I heard a question there. I do not know what the administration's logic is for why they chose to make that cut. We will certainly be exploring that cut in more detail as we get into the, into the budget process and in the budget hearings.
Any other questions? Oh, Senator Song.
Mr. Chairman, I first want to say what everybody else has said. I want to thank you for all the work that you've done. Just one question. I see on page 32 about the 389 contracted workers. I know a lot of these are temporary positions. I just don't know if any of them are permanent. Can you be more specific about that? Are these just positions that you just need to fill in for a temporary time, or are they permanent ones? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I can't speak for all of them, but for the majority of these, they're full-time positions. They've been in their position for most part, like 2 or more years. Contractual positions are meant to be temporary, but agencies sometimes hire them. They find out they need them permanently. So this process just allows them to bring them on permanently. So we assume that all 389 of these positions are on the job right now, ready to be converted to regular positions, and it really is just supplying them with the full benefit of state employment.
State, we get a lot of contracts and a lot of contract workers who through DNR or transportation, and some of them are temporal, but it doesn't say that, so that's why I asked. Thank
Right,
you.
no, this is separate from staffing contracts that are funded through the budget where, a separate private company is hiring them. These are people that have already been contracted directly with the state.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to follow up on the question about the Child Victims Act of 2023. Other states have had to grapple with these issues, and I understand that we may have some sort of settlement agreement in 25 or 26. In other states where they have gone down this path, have there been multi-year opportunities to pay that out? Because if you do the math here, that is quite a lot that we would have to factor in. So I'm just wondering sort of over what period of time have other states addressed these issues?
We can do some research on that. I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Had the president, Senator just left a few minutes ago. He had to run to another meeting. I would have offered him an opportunity to say something. Mr. Chairman?
I want to thank our speaker for joining us here today, and and the whole members of the Appropriations Committee.
Very good. All right, with that, again, we thank you, everyone, and we look forward to an interesting and fun rest of the session. We are adjourned.